Hey, boys and girls, I am continuing to read the chapter, The Plan. Remember, I had said it was really long, so I broke it up into two parts. So the pilots are now on their way to Giant Country. He's leading us to a disaster, cried the head of the army. He was shaking with fear. In the seat behind him sat the head of the Air Force, who was even more terrified. You don't mean to tell me we've gone right off the map, he cried, leaning forward to look. That's exactly what I'm telling you, cried the Air Force man. Look for yourself. Here's the very last map in the whole flaming atlas. We went off that over an hour ago. He turned the page, and as in all atlases, there were two completely blank pages at the very end. So now we must be somewhere here, he said, putting a finger on the blank page. Where's here? Cried the head of the army. The young pilot was still grinning broadly. He said to them, That's why they always put two blank pages at the back of the atlas. Those are for the new countries. You're meant to fill them in yourself. The head of the Air Force glanced down at the ground. Just look at this godforsaken desert, he cried. All the trees are dead and all the rocks are blue. The giant has stopped, the young pilot said. He's waving us down. The pilots throttled back the engines and all 9 helicopters landed safely on the great yellow wasteland. Then each of them lowered a ramp from its belly. 9 jeeps, one from each helicopter, were driven down the ramps, and each jeep contained 6 soldiers and a vast quantity of thick rope and heavy chains. I don't see any giants, the head of the army said. The giants is all just out of sight over there, the BFG told him. But if you was taking these swashbucking, noisy bellow poppers any closer, all the giants is waking up at once, and then pop goes the weasel. So you want us to go by jeep? The head of the army said. Yes, said the BFG, but you must all be very, very hushy quiet. No roaring of motors, no shouting, no mucking about, no piggery jokery. The BFG, with Sophie still in his ear, trotted forward, and the jeeps followed close behind. Suddenly, the most dreadful rumbling noise was heard by everyone. The head of the army went pea-green in the face. Those are guns, he cried. There's a battle raging somewhere up ahead of us. Turn back, the lot of you. Let's get out of here. Pig spiffle, said the BFG. Those noises is not guns. Of course they are, shouted the head of the army. I'm a military man, and I know when I hear one. Turn back. Those is just the giants snortling in their sleep, the BFG said. I is a giant myself, and I know a giant snortling when I hear one. Are you sure? The army man said. Positive, said the BFG. Proceed with caution, the army man ordered, and they all moved on. Then they saw them. Even at a distance, they were enough to scare the daylights out of the soldiers. But when they got close and saw what the giants really looked like, they began to sweat with fear. 9 fearsome, ugly, half-naked, 50 feet long brutes lay sprawled over the ground in various grotesque attitudes of sleep. Excuse me. And the sound of their snoring was indeed like a gunfire in battle. The BFG raised a hand and all the jeeps stopped. And the soldiers got out. What happens if one of them wakes up? Whispered the head of the army, his knees knocking together with fear. If any one of them is waking up, he will gobble you down before you can say Nakjife, BFG answered. Me is the only one who won't be gobbled up because giants is never eating giants. Me and Sophie is the only safe ones because I is hiding her if that happens. The head of the army took several paces to the back, and so did the head of the Air Force. They climbed rather quickly back into their jeep, ready to make a fast getaway if necessary. Move forward, men, said the head of the army. Go forward and do your duty bravely. The soldiers crept forward with their ropes and chains, all of them trembling mightily. No one even dared to speak a word. The BFG, with Sophie now sitting in the palm of his hand, stood nearby, watching the whole operation. To give the soldiers their due, they were extremely courageous. There were 6 well-trained, efficient men working on each giant, and within 10 minutes, 8 out of the 9 giants had been trussed up like chickens and were still snoring contentedly. The 9th, who happened to be the flesh lump eater, was causing trouble for the soldiers because he was lying with his right arm tucked underneath his body. It was impossible to tie his wrists and arms together without first getting that arm out from underneath him. Very, very cautiously, the 6 soldiers who were working on the flesh lump leader began to pull at the huge arm, trying to release it. Then the flesh lump leader opened his tiny piggy black eyes. "Which of you foul pesters is wiggling my arm?" he bellowed. "Is that you, rotsome man-hugger?" Suddenly, he saw the soldiers, and in a flash he was sitting up. He looked around, and he saw more soldiers. With a roar, he leapt to his feet. The soldiers were petrified with fear and frozen where they stood. They had no weapons with them, and the head of the army put his jeep into reverse. "Human beings," the flesh lumper yelled. "What is all you flesh-bucking, rotsome, half-baked beans doing in our country?" He made a grab at a soldier and swept him up in his hand. "I is having early suppers today," he shouted, holding the poor squirming soldier at arm's length and roaring with laughter. Sophie, standing on the palm of the BFG's hand, was watching, horror-struck. "Do something," she cried, "quick, before he eats him." "Put that human being down," the BFG shouted. The flesh lump leader turned and stared at the BFG. "What is you doing here with all these grotty twiglets? You is making me very suspicious." The BFG made a rush at the flesh lump leader, but the colossal 54-foot-high giant simply knocked him over with a flick of his free arm. And at the same time, Sophie fell off the BFG's palm and onto the ground. Her mind was racing. She must do something. She must. And then she remembered the sapphire pin the queen had pinned to her chest. Quickly, she undid it. "I is gonna guzzle you nice and slow," the flesh lump eater was saying to the soldier. "Then I is guzzling 10 or 20 more of you midgy little maggots down there. You's not getting away from me because I is galloping 50 times faster than you." Sophie ran up behind the flesh lump leader, and she was holding her pin between her fingers, and when she was right up close to the great hairy leg, she rammed that long pin of the brooch as hard as she could into the flesh lump leader's right ankle. It went deep into the flesh and stayed there. The giant gave a roar of pain and jumped high in the air. He dropped the soldier and made a grab for his ankle. The BFG, knowing what a coward the flesh lump eater was, saw his chance. "He was bitten by a snake. I seen it biting you. It was a frightsome, poisonous viper, and it was deadly, dangerous windscreen viper." "Ah, save our souls!" bellowed the flesh sleeper. "Sound the crumpets! I is bitten by a suspicious, venison, windscripper's viper." He flopped to the ground and sat there, howling his head off and clutching his ankle with both hands. His fingers felt the pin. "Oh, the teeth of the viper still sticking into me. I is feeling the teeth sticking into my anklet." The BFG saw his second chance. "Must be getting those viper teeth out at once, otherwise you is deader than duck soup. I is helping you." BFG knelt down beside the flesh lump eater. "You must grab your ankle very tight with both hands. That will stop the poisonous juices from your venison viper going up your leg into your heart." So the flesh lump eater grabbed his ankles with both hands. "Now close your eyes and grittle your teeth and look up to heaven and say your prayers while I is taking out the teeth of the viper." The terrified flesh lump eater did exactly what he was told. The BFG signaled for some rope, and a soldier rushed over to him, and with both the flesh lump eater's hands gripping his ankle, it was a simple matter for the BFG to tie the ankles and the hands together with a knot. I was pulling out that frightsome viper's teeth. As the BFG, he pulled the knot tight. "Do it quickly, before I is pizened to death." "Oh, there he is," said the BFG. "You can look now." When the flesh sleeper saw that he was trussed up like a turkey, he gave a yell so loud that the heavens trembled, and he rolled and he wriggled and he fought and he figgled and he squirmed and he squiggled. But there was not a thing he could do. "Well done," Sophie said. "Well done you," said the BFG down at the little girl. "You was saving all of our lives." "Will you please get my pin back for me? It belongs to the queen." The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the flesh lump eater's ankle, and the flesh lump eater howled. The BFG wiped the pin and handed it back to Sophie. Curiously, not one of the other 8 snoring giants had woken up during this schmozzle. "When you was only sleeping 1 or 2 hours a day, you was sleeping extra doubly deep," the BFG explained. The heads of the Army and the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeep. "Her Majesty will be very pleased with me," said the head of the Army. "I shall probably get a medal with what's the next move? Now, you was all driving over here to my cave to load up my bottles of dream." "We can't waste time with that rubbish," the Army general said. It's the Queen's order, Sophie said. She was now back in the BFG's hands. So the 9 Jeep drove across to the BFG's cave, and the great dream loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars in all to be loaded up, more than 5,000 to each Jeep, and it took over an hour to finish the job. While the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountains on a mysterious errand. And when they came back, the BFG had the sack the size of a small house slung over her shoulder. "What's that you've got in there?" the head of the army demanded. "Well, curiosity is killing the rat," said the BFG, and he turned away from that silly man. When he was sure that all his precious dreams had been safely loaded onto the Jeeps, the BFG said, "Now we is driving back to the belly poppers and picking up those frightsome giants." The Jeeps drove back to the helicopters. The 50,000 dreams were carried carefully jar by jar onto the helicopter. And the soldiers climbed back on board. But the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were lying. It was a fine sight to see them, these great air machines hovering over the giants. It was an even finer sight to see the giants being woken up by the terrific thundering of the engines overhead. And it was even the finest sight of all was to observe those 9 hideous, squirming and twisting about on the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from the ropes and chains. The 9 giant-carrying helicopters each chose a separate giant, hovered directly over him, and very strong steel hawsers with hooks on the end of them were lowered from the front and the rear of each helicopter, and the BFG securely secured the hooks to the giant's chains. Then, very slowly, the giants were winched up into the air, parallel with the ground. The giants roared and bellowed, but there was nothing they could do. The BFG, with Sophie once more resting comfortably in his ear, set off at a gallop for England. The helicopters all banked around and followed after him. It was an amazing spectacle, those 9 helicopters winging through the sky, each with a trussed-up 50-foot-long giant slung underneath it. The giants themselves must have found it an interesting experience. They never stopped bellowing, but their howls were drowned by the noise of the engines. And when it began to get dark, the helicopters switched on powerful searchlights and trained them onto the galloping giant so as to keep him in sight. They flew right through the night and arrived in England just as dawn was breaking. That is the end of the chapter. Boys and girls, we actually only have one teeny tiny chapter left, so I will be reading that tomorrow and finishing our story of the BFG. I do want to show you that picture, though, of those 9 helicopters with those giants being slung from underneath them. All right, the final chapter of the BFG is titled The Feeding Time, and I will be reading that to you tomorrow. Bye, guys.